People wonder, where do I start with home cheese making? It's not so important where you start. What's more important is that you continue. Hi, my name is Luella. I'm a home cheese maker, but I'm a little more than that. I've been making cheeses on farms, in my kitchen, and in real big cheese factories for about 12 years. Over the course of that time, I've become completely in love with the process of cheese making. My current role is I am a mobile cheese making teacher, which means I drive my car full of milk to your office or your birthday party and teach you and your friends how to make cheese. It's a little bit of a quirky job, but it's very fun for me because I love cheese making so much, and I like people, and I like teaching people skills that are ancient and really practical. Cheese making is one of them. Bringing all that information that I've gathered over my decade of cheese making together, I decided that I would compile it into a book. So I have written a book called Kitchen Creamery, and it is 225 pages of home cheese making glory. It teaches you everything from how to make yogurts and kefirs, all different styles of yogurts, to fresh cheeses, ricotta, mascarpone, farmer's cheese, quark, queso fresco. Moves into middle-aged cheeses like cheeses you'd age for 2 to 3 to 4 months, like cheddar jack, the one you just learned, or are about to learn. And then it keeps going. I teach how to make mold-ripened cheeses, so camembert style, cheeses that have mold on the outer rind, as well as interior mold-ripened cheeses, so blues. And then I teach, the book includes pasta filata style cheeses, so all the mozzarellas, scamorzas, caciocavallos, burrata. And then finally ends with a few ideas of how to make cheeses that you can age a long time, so maybe a couple of years. Not that I think that you should wait that long, but the idea being that there are recipes for people that want to have cheese in a day and recipes for people who have lots of patience and want to wait a year. So all this, and how to build a smoker, how to build a cheese cave, how to wrap your cheeses, how to store your cheeses, how to present your cheeses, pulled it all together into this book by published by Chronicle Books called Kitchen Creamery. So how did I become a mobile cheese making teacher? It's a good question. Well, the truth is that I was a cheesemaker at a creamery back in New England, and then my partner got a job out west here in San Francisco, and I had to make a decision, my husband or my vat. I chose my husband. I moved west, but I also found myself in a city with no goats and no sheep, and I had to figure out how to take my obscure skill set, cheese making, and put it to use. So in my many years of selling cheese at farmers markets, I always heard people say, do you teach classes? How can I learn? I've always wanted to make cheese. My grandma used to make cheese. Oh my gosh, I grew up with this one kind of cheese I wish I could buy. So in the back of my mind was this realization, this knowledge that people were really curious about how cheese was made. And so I opened up the business called San Francisco Milkmaid, and it took off. So it told me, the idea was meant to be because people are completely fascinated right now about how things are made, how they can live a little more independently, how they don't have to depend on just their car and the big box grocery store to get the things they need. So I've had a lot of fun, teaching people these skills as the San Francisco Milkmaid, as a mobile cheese-making teacher. One of the things maybe I can offer people, having hung out with cheesemakers, having been a member of cheese guilds for a fair chunk of time, people always want to know, what are the mistakes I should avoid? And for the home cheesemaker, I would say don't get hung up on mistakes. Just start making cheese. That the most important thing you can do is continue to make cheese. To take a recipe and not make it just once, but make it again and again and again. I really truly feel that cheese making, you can learn it in a book, you can follow a recipe, but you don't really learn cheese making until you spend a lot of time just holding the curds, stirring the vat, flipping the cheese, brushing the cheese. You just have to spend hours and time to learn the craft, the art of cheese making. So I would say don't get hung up on mistakes, just keep going. For the home cheesemaker, I would add in one other thing that I'm very loyal to. It's the idea of good milk. So not all milk is the same. In fact, we have quite a bit of not so wonderful milk in this country, meaning milk coming from enormous factory farms. So I try not to be too political because I really like to talk to everybody about cheese making. So I don't go too deep into the politics of milk and food, although I care a lot about it. And so I will say, buy the nicest milk you can. It's really worth it to spend $7, $8, $10 on a gallon. It sounds crazy, but if you've never been on a dairy farm, you won't believe how much work, how much energy, how much water it takes to get grass turned into milk. You'll realize it's quite valuable. It's really beautiful. So if you spend a little more, buy a really nice gallon of milk, you're gonna end up with cheese that's way better than making cheese with less than nice milk. Try and start making cheese with as few extra things as possible. In the book, I give you a lot of information about how to repurpose things like old linens or how to turn fruit baskets into cheese forms. So don't worry about all the things that you can buy. Instead, just know that you can start making cheese using pretty much what you have in the kitchen. The essentials, if I had to list the essentials, would be good milk, talked about that, a good thermometer. That's very helpful to have an accurate test of the temperature. With time, when you're ready, a good pH meter is also very helpful, but don't worry about that for now. So good milk, a thermometer, a large enough vat or pot that you can make a quantity of that you can work with a quantity of milk that's going to yield you enough cheese. So what I'm saying is, don't spend all day turning 1 gallon of milk into a little wheel of cheddar. Please go out and buy a lobster pot, a big pasta pot, borrow it, something, so that you can work 2 gallons or 4 gallons. It'll make you stay in love with cheese making versus grow frustrated. Yeah, that essentially sums it up. You need good milk, a decently sized pot, a good thermometer, and most of the other stuff you can repurpose or find in your own kitchen. For example, cheese molds or cheese forms. It's awfully nice to have the real ones, the professional ones, but the truth is you could take a bean can or a industrial sized enchilada sauce can, cut off the top, cut off the bottom, and that could be your cheese form or your cheese mold. So you don't have to start out with buying a bunch of stuff. You can start out with just being creative and getting some cheeses made. Connected to that, people wonder, where do I start with home cheese making? Do I start with mozzarella, the quick mozzarella? Do I start with cheddar? In the book, I lead you from simpler to more complex recipes. And you can definitely go in that progression. What I would say is, it's not so important where you start. What's more important is that you continue. So I think start with fresh cheeses that you eat within a day, or you can eat within a short turnaround. But you don't have to make ricotta and queso fresco for months and months and months before you start making a Gouda. In fact, if you wanted, you could start with Gouda, and if the wheel's not perfect on your first run, just commit to making another wheel. So I think that you can learn cheese making with about every recipe. Definitely cheeses that don't have to be aged are much easier than cheeses that need to be kept in a cave and held for several months. You're maybe wondering how one would make a transition from being a home cheesemaker, somebody who just works with 2-gallon pots, 3-gallon pots, whatever, all the way to being a real, true, certified, professional cheesemaker. The answer is there are many roads. You could probably jump fairly quickly from being a home cheesemaker to being a professional cheesemaker if you were willing to come in as an assistant cheesemaker to a local creamery. There's definitely a need from local creameries to be able to hire people who are familiar with milk, familiar with rennet, familiar with cultures. So if you get your skills sharpened, you might find yourself donning a hairnet and big rubber boots sooner than you think. If you have the dream of making cheese as your, if you have the dream of having your own creamery, the road's a little bit longer, and that's because the facility where you make the cheese is pretty specific, meaning you can't just make cheese in your kitchen and sell it legally at a farmer's market. You have to make it in a certified facility. And to complicate things a little bit more, creameries are not just restaurant kitchens. There are specific requirements that make creameries meet FDA standards. For example, the drain has to be the right dimensions, the slant of the floor has to be correct. Creameries are watched pretty carefully by government regulators, and that's because there's a bit of a scare or worry around milk and fresh cheeses being vectors for pathogens. So that said, as a home cheesemaker, if you dream of becoming a professional cheesemaker, having your own creamery specifically, know that it's a little bit longer of a road, but it's not an impossible one. And there are many resources out there in the United States, people who advise on how to construct creameries, people who advise on business plans for creameries. You might also start to think about whether or not you would like to be simply a creamery or a farmstead creamery. Farmstead creamery meaning the animals giving you the milk for your cheese live on the same property. That, of course, is a much bigger task than simply buying the milk in from a co-op, a milk co-op. However, on a farmstead operation, you have enormous amounts more control over the milk. You get to know the animals, you get to know what they're eating, you get to know where they are in their lactation cycle. So it's a big question you have to ask yourself. But if you find that you're truly passionate about cheese making, I would say start with making cheeses continuously in your home kitchen, bravely bringing those cheeses around to neighbors and friends and getting some feedback, and then from there starting to plug around on the internet to find people that might consult you, and also potentially looking at real estate or properties that might open up. It won't be the cheapest avenue towards becoming a professional cheesemaker, but many people do it, and in many places in the country where there isn't a lot of local cheese production, it's a market niche that's waiting to be filled. The most common question I get from students is the question, why are cheeses so different from one another? Like, there's only so much milk in the world, or types of milk in the world, but the number of cheese varieties and cheese characteristics that we find in the cheese section is phenomenal. It's astronomical, the number of flavors we can find in cheese. The answer to that question is that a lot of things contribute to the characteristic of the cheese. On the farm, it's the animal, it's the breed, it's the individual animal, it's the diet, the lactation, the weather, it's the time of year, it's the temperature of that day. Lots of factors contribute to how the milk is going to taste and the cheese is eventually going to taste based on what happens on the farm. Moving into the creamery, the way myself, a cheesemaker, affects the way the cheese turns out is based on, so we have our milk, we can then affect the milk based on which cultures we add. Those are the bacteria or the yeast or the fungus. Based on how hot or how cool we keep the milk or the curd as we cook and stir the cheese, how fast or how slowly we let acid develop, so how fast is that fermentation or how slow is it, how much water do we allow to stay in the curd versus how much water do we drive out of the curd. Then when we have the finished curds, do we put them in small cheese forms, big cheese forms? Do we make long logs? Do we make a mix that becomes like a spreadable tub of cheese? Do we add other ingredients like cumin seeds or fenugreek or chilies or peppercorns? Do we add, and then, okay, so we've got the cheese, it's now a cheese looking form. We move on to the next chapter of the cheese's development, which is the affinage. How is the cheese aged? So is the cheese vacuum sealed, wax dipped? Does it have molds, beautiful molds growing on the rind? Is the cheesemaker putting beer on the rind and rubbing the beer in? There's 1,000 ways you can affect how the cheese turns out based on what you do during the affinage. And then finally, this is where Kiri from the cheese school comes in. What happens to that cheese after it's done and between its finish and it making its way to your dinner plate or your cheese board? So was the cheese well handled or poorly handled? Was it kept in a refrigerator for months? Was it just made? Was it packed in glass? Was it packed in plastic? Was it accompanied by a perfect condiment? Was it standing alone? All these factors create the diversity of cheeses that we have out there. So it's no one single thing that makes a cheese turn into a cheddar. So I've given you a little background about myself, and I can tell you're interested in cheese making. That's great. Now let's go ahead and head into the kitchen and start making cheese. I'm gonna teach you several recipes. I'm gonna teach you how to make buttermilk, how to make kefir, how to make farmer's cheese, how to make chev, both fresh chev and mold ripened chev. And I'm also gonna teach you how to make cheddar jack or Monterey jack. And that's a cheese that you can age and turn into a more robust, complex, fantastic cheese. And then the last thing I'm gonna teach you, I'm gonna teach you how to make mozzarella, quick mozzarella. And then from that quick mozzarella recipe, I'm gonna teach you how to make burrata. So you're gonna get tons of cheese recipes. Stay with me. Remember, heading into the kitchen, we're working with flames. We wanna make sure our kitchen's also very clean. I would clean up the kitchen. I would kick the kids and the animals, the dogs and the cats out while making cheese. I also always take care to tie back my hair or cover my hair with a hairnet or a baseball cap. I like to wear white when I make cheese in the kitchen. That sounds a little silly, but just imagine if a bunch of lint from your beautiful green cashmere sweater ends up in the vat. That would just be weird. If it's white, you might be off the hook. So let's take precaution heading into the kitchen. Let's have a lot of fun. And the main thing is make cheese and don't give up. Keep making these recipes and you're only gonna be drawn deeper and deeper into this magical rabbit hole. Before I start with any cheese recipe, it's important to me that I make sure that my kitchen is cleaned up and that I don't have any pathogens or contaminants that would interrupt my cheese recipe. There are a couple of ways that I go ahead and clean up my kitchen and clean my utensils. Sometimes I use products like bleach or iodophor.